Let's dive into the specs and figure out what's really going on.
When you compare an RTX 4060 with an RTX 3060, the numbers aren't exactly representative of real-world render performance as you would expect. The RTX 3060 has 28 SMs while the 4060 has 24 SMs. Not only that, but the 3060 has more CUDA cores at 3584 while the 4060 has only 3072. The 3060 has more ray tracing cores and more tensor cores and a wider memory bus of 192 versus the 128 on the 4060. However, all of these specs would have you believe the 3060 will outperform the 4060, but that isn't the case at all. Due to the improvements made in architecture, we get higher clocks on the 4060 and a larger L2 cache of 24 MB that all add up to a 19% performance uplift that gives the 4060 the lead when it comes to in-game performance. So ensure to do your research and watch some benchmarks before assuming the numbers will always add up to performance, since that isn't always the case since improvements in architecture.
Speaking of GPUs, let's see how AMD compares in this battle.
And with AMD, you often get more VRAM, which is always an added bonus.
Now let's talk about some performance testing.
So I tested some games that use quite a lot of VRAM, starting with Flight Simulator. I have the settings on the highest at 4K, and we were using over 10 GB of memory. We got an average of 13.5 FPS with a 1% low of 9.9 and a 0.1% low of 8.9 FPS. So the FPS really wasn't good here, but if we compare it to the 8GB card, the 16GB RX 580 actually performs better. The RX 580 8GB only got 10.9 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 9.4 and a 0.1% low of 8.3 FPS. I guess this does go to show that the 16GB can actually make a difference in games, but the only problem is the actual RX 580 GPU inside is just not powerful enough to play games at these settings. Finally, I tested Star Wars Jedi Survivor at pretty much max settings at 4K. The 16GB RX 580 was using over 10GB of VRAM again. It achieved an average of 7.2 FPS with a 1% low of 6.9 and a 0.1% low of 6.8 FPS. So this is pretty bad, but at least the RX 580 8GB performed worse at just 6.5 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 5.1 and a 0.1% low of 4.9 FPS.
It's not just about the hardware, the architecture matters too.
Because we're going to render one frame and generate 3. If I said 4 frames at full HD, 4K, that's 33 million pixels or so. Out of that 33 million pixels, we computed only 2. It is an absolute miracle that we can computationally using programmable shaders and our ray tracing engine, to compute 2 million pixels and have AI predict all of the other 33. And as a result, we're able to render at incredibly high performance because AI does a lot less computation. It takes, of course, an enormous amount of training to produce that, but once you train it, the generation is extremely efficient.
Now let's unravel some myths around NVIDIA versus AMD.
Don't make these mistakes when choosing a graphics card in 2024 and 2025. I have compiled the most common mistakes that people make when choosing a graphics card. For those of you who are new to this, then this video should be helpful, and for those of you with experience, you might end up actually agreeing with some of the mentions in the video, so enjoy watching. The first misconception is that NVIDIA is better than AMD. This has been one of the most common misconceptions and stereotypes surrounding the choice of either buying from Team Green or Team Red, with most people defaulting to NVIDIA as their first option, all because they believe NVIDIA is better than AMD. This is partly due to NVIDIA being at the forefront of progress, with features like being the first to introduce ray tracing, having better upscaling, first to bring us more features like frame generation, including their massive involvement in AI development and such. This is all great, of course, if not for one thing: price to performance, or FPS per dollar, which is what the competition is all about. The competitors here being AMD and more recently Intel, both of whom have their own slice of the GPU market, with AMD being the leading of the two.
As we wind down, let's examine a crucial factor: cooling.
Cooling solutions end up making the cards too expensive, while not adding much functionality for the card for the price. For example, a triple fan cooler on a low-end or mid-range card will cost more than a dual fan cooler version, while the performance will remain the same and the temps will probably be lowered by 2 to 5 degrees, but you will end up paying more for the extra fan, which you can easily do without. Modern card temps range from 65 to 85 degrees or more on the hotspot, so don't obsess over cooling and end up paying an extra 50 or 100 bucks just to get a triple fan version of a card that has dual fan options, or worse, opting for a water-cooled version that could be $300 to $400 more than an air-cooled version of the same card, so be cautious when choosing the different designs available. You could always check the reviews of the card to see if anyone has had overheating issues before you buy. That way you can rest assured you spent the right amount of money on the right cooling. Our fifth issue is some of the specs aren't always as black and white as you would think. So what do I mean by this? When it comes to different architecture, odds are some specs will differ or seem like a step backwards, but that's not always the case. For example,
And remember, it's not always about having the latest specs.
She performs better than the RX 580 2040 ASP, possibly due to the higher clock speeds. So the 8GB card, we got an average of 17.3 FPS with a 1% low of 13.6 and a 0.1% low of 12.4 FPS. So this is actually higher than the 16GB cards, except for the 1% and 0.1% lows were a bit lower. Resident Evil 3 was next, and I cranked all the settings up to the highest at 4K. It said it was going to use about 12.82GB of graphics memory, which got me excited. But when I actually got into the game, we were only using about 8GB. So thanks Resident Evil 3 for that. The FPS was really good on this game as it's not too difficult to run. We got 52.1 FPS on average, and a 1% low of 44.6, and a 0.1% low of 21.1 FPS. Next up
Now let's take a closer look at Ollama and AI performance.
For running Llama models. Ollama simplifies the process of using large language models on your local machine. To install Ollama, I ran the script provided. Using Ollama's CLI, downloading the model was ready to test its performance on the Orin Nano. To measure throughput, I used Ollama's verbose generated per second, GPU use, and latency per token. Picture of how the hardware handles the intensive AI work. The Orin Nano's reliance on its CUDA cores, the system managed to generate around 21 tokens per second. The Orin Nano proved it's more than capable. For comparison, I ran the same test on an M2 Mac Pro, and as expected, the Mac outperformed the tokens at an impressive 113 tokens per second, for handling AI tasks. Underscores the efficiency of the Orin Nano, how close the Orin Nano comes given its size. So why would you use an Orin Nano?
Finally, let's wrap things up with the essential takeaways.
Intel's 14th gen and the new 200 series, and they both come with a ton of options when it comes to the number of cores you're looking for. However, if you feel the need to get a CPU that can remain relevant for a couple of years, then I recommend to always check what the consoles are using. And this generation of consoles is using 8-core CPUs with 16 threads, so if you have the budget for it, that would be a good baseline to help you get a CPU that holds its own for another 2 generations or more, as most games are often going to be optimized to run on similar hardware as the current generation of consoles, so you can always count on getting it.
So let's make sure to check our benchmarks and make wise choices.
and plug the graphics card in so we can get some tests running. Okay, so now that we're in the desktop, we can see GPU-Z shows that there is 16GB of Micron memory. AMD software also shows 16GB of memory, and so does Task Manager. In order to get the most out of this card, we need to try and find some games that actually utilize the amount of memory this card has. Like, just because something has more memory, it doesn't mean it will get any performance boost.
As we conclude, let's remember, the best GPU for you is the one that meets your needs.
When you compare an RTX 4060 with an RTX 3060, the numbers aren't exactly representative of real-world render performance as you would expect. The RTX 3060 has 28 SMs while the 4060 has 24 SMs. Not only that, but the 3060 has more CUDA cores at 3584 while the 4060 has only 3072. The 3060 has more ray tracing cores and more tensor cores and a wider memory bus of 192 versus the 128 on the 4060. However, all of these specs would have you believe the 3060 will outperform the 4060, But that isn't the case at all. Due to the improvements made in architecture, we get higher clocks on the 4060 and a larger L2 cache of 24 megabytes that all add up to a 19% performance uplift that gives the 4060 the lead when it comes to in-game performance. So ensure to do your research and watch some benchmarks before assuming the numbers will always add up to performance, since that isn't always the case since improvements in architecture.
So with that said, happy gaming.
And with AMD you often get more VRAM, which is always an added bonus.
Make informed choices, and may your frame rates be ever in your favor.